everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how you doing? Um, what we're going to be talking about today is something that I keep hearing people talking about, and I was like, well, let's do the pros and cons about it. You know what I mean? But before we jump into it, hey there, my name is Autumn, and on this channel we talk about current events that happen here in the States as well as abroad in other countries. I do have my original channel back, so I'm so excited about that. Autumn's Backyard Garden. The link is in the description box below. I do also have a Patreon channel, and we talk about stuff over there that we can't talk about here due to YouTube's terms and policies. Um, and when you sign up over there, you get a week trial for free. And we talk about some really awesome stuff over there. We go live over there, okay? And we have great fun over there. So now let's dive in, okay? I've been hearing, things like get rid of income tax, no tax on wages, no property tax, no inheritance tax, no sales tax on used homes and items, no vehicle registration fees, no licensing fees, no tax on food and pharmaceuticals, abolishment of the Federal Reserve banks and the IRS. Now, I have been doing my research, and I have, literally, and I'm going to give you my honest opinion on everything. And I'm going to be, giving you critique. I'm going to give you the pros and cons of every single thing. And this is after I have done some deep dive searching. Okay. When it comes to the no income tax, the pros, right? Eliminates a major burden on individuals and businesses, potentially increasing disposable income and incentivizing work and investment. Could simplify compliance and reducing bureaucracy. The cons. Income tax is a primary revenue source for governments. Okay, removing it would create a massive funding gap for public services like infrastructure, defense, and welfare. Alternatives might disproportionately burden lower income groups. Consideration. How would essential services be funded? A shift to voluntary contributions? User fees? That could lead to underfunding and inequality in access. No tax on wages. The pros. Increases in take-home pay, especially for low and middle income workers. Boosting purchasing power, potentially stimulating economy activity. The cons. Wages are a subset of income, so this overlaps with eliminating income tax. If applied separately, it could complicate tax codes, like distinguishing wages from other income. Loss of revenue would exacerbate budget deficits unless replaced. What's the consideration? Well, could be paired with a flat tax or exemption for low wages to balance equity and revenue needs, but enforcement would still require oversight. No property tax. As you know, in the state of Florida, our governor is trying to wipe out property tax, right? The pros. Reduce costs for homeowners and businesses, potentially lowering housing prices and encouraging property ownership. This eliminates a tax that penalizes asset retention. What are the cons? Well, property taxes fund local services like school, roads, and emergency services. In the United States, they generate about $600 billion annually for municipalities. Without them, local governments could collapse or rely on regressive alternatives like sales tax. What's the consideration? Well, replacing property taxes with land value taxes, like taxing unimproved land value, could maintain revenue while encouraging development, but it's still a tax. What about the no inheritance tax? Well, the pros, It would allow wealth to transfer across generations without government intervention, potentially encouraging wealth accumulation and family support. What are the cons? Inheritance tax, like U.S. estate tax, affect only the ultra wealthy. Estates like $13.6 million in 2025, okay? And this would reduce wealth concentration. Revenue loss is minimal, like $17 billion a year in the U.S., but abolishing it could exacerbate inequality. So, what's the consideration? Inequality concerns might outweigh revenue loss. A high exemption threshold always limits the tax's scope, so abolishing it may have symbolic rather than practical impact. So now let's talk about the no sales tax on used homes and used items. The pros: reduces costs for buyers in secondhand goods and homes, encouraging reuse and affordability. Could stimulate secondary markets. The cons: sales tax on used items vary widely. Many places don't tax them. Exempting used homes could reduce state and local revenue, like transfer taxes. Defining used could create loopholes. So, the consideration: this is feasible, but it's narrow. Broader tax reform might be more impactful, though it risks regressive effects on low income buyers. So, no vehicle registration fees. The pros: lower costs for vehicle owners, especially in high fee states, could reduce administrative burdens. The cons: registration fees fund road maintenance and DMV operations, $50 billion a year in the U.S. alone. Without them, infrastructure could deteriorate or states might raise other taxes. So consider this: uses, bases, fees, tolls, mileage taxes could replace registration fees but might face privacy concerns or inequitable impacts. So then, no licensing fees. The pros: reduces costs for professionals like doctors, barbers, and businesses, potentially lowering service prices and barriers to entry. What are the cons? Licensing fees ensure regulatory oversight like safety and competence, and eliminating them would weaken standards, risking public safety. Revenue losses is small but non trivial for specific agencies. So, what to consider is streamlining licensing without eliminating fees could balance cost reduction with oversight needs. So, no tax on food and pharmaceuticals. The pros are lower costs for essentials, disproportionately benefiting low income households. Many states already exempt groceries and prescriptions from sales tax. Florida doesn't have tax on food, but we do have tax on prescriptions. The cons: further exemptions could strain state budgets, especially in states reliant on sales tax. Defining food and pharmaceuticals could be complex, like supplements, prepared foods, right? So consider it. This is already partly implemented in many places. Expanding exemptions is feasible but requires offsetting revenue sources. Abolishment of the Federal Reserve Banks and the IRS. The pros: critics argue that the Fed distorts market via monetary policy and benefit banks over individuals. Abolishing it could force a return on decentralized or commodity based currency like gold. The cons: the Fed stabilizes the economy through interest rates and money supply management, and without it, financial crises could worsen, like the pre Fed panics in 1907. A gold standard might limit growth and exacerbate deflation. So consider it: replacing the Fed with algorithmic monetary policy or private banking is theoretical and untested at scale. Transition risks are massive. The IRS, well, the pros: it eliminates a disliked agency, simplifying tax collection if taxes remain, could reduce compliance costs, $400 billion a year in the US. The cons: without the IRS, tax collection, if taxes remain, becomes chaotic. Even a flat tax needs enforcement. Revenue collapse would cripple government functions. consideration, a smaller streamlined agency could handle simplified taxes, but total abolishment assumes no tax system at all. So the broader implications. Funding government, eliminating these taxes and fees could reduce U.S. federal and state revenues by trillions annually. Federal budget, 6.5 trillion, state local 2 trillion. Without revenue, public goods like defense, healthcare, infrastructure would require privatization, user fees, voluntary funding, risking under provision and inequality. The economic effects, tax cuts could boost growth short term, but risk inflation if spending is not cut. Long term, reduced public investment like education, R&D, could harm productivity. The inequality, removing progressive taxes like income and inheritance, while relying on consumption taxes, could shift burdens onto lower income tax groups, worsening with the wealth gaps. The practicality is abolishing the Fed and the IRS assumes a fundamental restructuring of the economy and the government. Historical attempts at similar reforms, like the 19th century free banking, faced instability. Public resistance to reduced services could be significant. So, what's an alternative approach? Middle ground could involve simplifying taxes, flat income tax with higher exemptions, or a broad-based consumption tax. Reducing but not eliminating fees tied to usage, like road tolls. Reforming the Fed for transparency rather than abolishing it. Streamlining the IRS for efficiency under a simpler tax code. What's my take? Well, while the vision of a no tax minimal government system is appealing for maximizing individual freedom and economic efficiency, it faces steep trade-offs. Public good requiring funding, eliminating revenue sources without clear alternatives risks societal instability. A balanced reform, simplifying taxes, targeting exemptions for essentials, and improving institutional accountability might achieve similar goals with less disruption. Abolishing the Fed and IRS sounds bold, but it ignores their role in modern economies. Reforming them is likely more practical. So, a system with no income tax, no tax on wages, no property tax, no inheritance tax, no sales tax on used homes, used goods, no vehicle registration, no licensing fees, no tax on food and pharmaceuticals, and the abolishment of the Fed and the IRS is theoretically possible, but faces significant practical challenges. Could it work? In short, it could. Only under significant, specific, highly specific, and unlikely conditions, such as radically reduced government role. Radically. Widespread societal acceptance of privatized services. Stable alternative monetary system. However, the risks of economic collapse, underfunded public goods, increased inequality make it improbable without major structural reforms and safeguards. Now, here's why it could work. If the government functions are drastically reduced in only essential services like basic defense and courts, funding needs dropping significantly. Historic examples like the 19th century U.S. government operated with minimal taxes, relying on tariffs and land sales. Voluntary contribution, user fees, or private provision could theoretically cover some services like private roads, schools, or healthcare. No tax revenues like natural resources, royalties, oils, minerals, land leasing, lotteries could fund small government. For example, Alaska's Permanent Fund uses oil revenue to reduce taxes. A shift to a single low rate consumption tax excluding food and pharmaceuticals and used items. This could generate revenue while aligning with everything else. Abolishing the Federal Reserve could lead to a return of commodity-based money, like gold or crypto. Private banks could issue currency as like in the 19th century free banking era. And if managed well, this could reduce reliance on central monetary policy, appealing to those wary of inflation or debt. Eliminating the IRS in most taxes would reduce compliance costs, like $400 billion a year in U.S. for tax prep, which is a small administrative body. It could handle minimum revenue collection like tariffs. Removing taxes and fees could boost disposable income, investments, entrepreneurship, potentially spurring growth. Lower cost for essentials like food, meds, used goods could improve affordability. But now I'm going to tell you why it's unlikely to work. And these are practical challenges that I'm going to tell you about. In the US, you've got federal, state, local governments. Okay, they collect about 8.5 trillion annually, and that's 2025 estimate. This eliminates most of income tax, 3 trillion, property tax, 600 billion, sales tax, 500 billion. Without replacement revenue, funding for defense, infrastructure, education, healthcare would collapse. Privatization or user fees could cover some services, but historical attempts, private fire brigades, right, often led to unequal access and under provision. Public resistance to losing services like Social Security, public schools would be fierce. Now, the Fed stabilizes like the economy through interest rates and money supply. Pre-Fed era saw frequent bank panics like I was talking about in 1907 and deflationary spirals. A gold standard or crypto-based system could limit growth and exacerbate recessions due to fixed money supply. Transitioning to a decentralized currency risks hyperinflation, though bank failures, fraud without robust regulation. Modern economies rely on flexible monetary policy to manage crises. Even a minimal tax system, tariffs, consumption tax, that requires enforcement. Without an IRS agency, tax evasion would skyrocket. Revenue collection would be chaotic. Historic attempts at tax-free systems like early U.S. reliance on tariffs still needed revenue agencies and faced smuggling and enforcement issues. Now, eliminating progressive taxes like income and inheritance while relying on consumption based or flat taxes shift the burden to lower income groups. This could worsen wealth inequality, which is already a major issue. I mean, top 1% in U.S. is down 32% wealth. Exempting food and pharmaceutical helps, but the overall tax burden reduction favors the wealthy, potentially fueling social unrest. Services like roads, schools, defense are public goods that markets struggle to provide equitably. For example, private roads might prioritize profitable routes, leaving rural areas underserved. Private education could exclude low-income families. And user fees or voluntary contributions often fall short. So modern societies expect government services like healthcare, pensions, infrastructure. Cutting them would face backlash, as seen in debates over austerity, like Greece post-2008. Convincing voters to accept a no-tax system is a hard sell. Transitioning to a no-Fed, no-IRS economy would require unprecedented coordination and a public buy-in, risking chaos during implementation, though. Most developed nations rely on tax systems similar to the US. A no tax model could weaken competitiveness, like underfunded defense, or isolate the country economically. Tariffs might replace taxes but could spark trade wars, as seen historically. Think of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. So, here are some key considerations. The proposal, right, of like all these no tax things assumes a libertarian style minimum state. If you envision no government at all, okay, anarcho capitalism, private markets could theoretically provide services, but historical examples are scarce, unstable. Somalia is stateless, period. Okay. Um, Abruptly dismantling taxes, the Fed, the IRS, it could trigger economic collapse, bank run ins, hyperinflation. A phased approach like gradual tax cuts, Fed reform, this might mitigate, but it delays the full vision. Some propose land value taxes, wealth taxes, transaction taxes to fund minimal government. These contradict the no tax spirit, but it could bridge the gap. Crypto or private currencies could replace Fed backed money, but they lack stability and universal acceptance. Like Bitcoin, for example, is volatile and slow for transactions. So, could it work like with modifications? A low flat consumption tax exempting food, meds, and used goods could fund a smaller government while aligning with the no income property tax goal. Instead of abolishing the Fed mandate like transparency or algorithmic policy to limit discretionary control, replace the IRS with a minimal agency to collect simplified taxes, reducing bureaucracy, and encourage private provisions of some services like healthcare while maintaining public funding for critical infrastructure. So, why do people really want this? Well, the taxes and the fees, like income, property, vehicle registration, it feels like a constant drain, right? In the US, the average taxpayer spends about 30 grand a year on federal state taxes. So, the promise of keeping that money is seductive. Many see the IRS as intrusive and the Fed as favoring banks or inflating away savings. So, framing these institutions as tools of control is what it seems, you know what I mean? So, no taxes, no fees, no complex systems sounds like ultimate freedom. And people envision lower costs of homes, food, meds, plus less red tape. But what people may not realize is that when there's no taxes, it means like what you expect is that when there's no taxes, it means more money in your pocket. Private markets will figure it out for services, right? But the reality is that taxes fund $8.5 trillion in U.S. federal, state, local spending. Without them, public goods like roads, schools, police, hospitals would face severe cuts or vanish. Privatization sounds appealing, but private providers prioritize profit over leaving rural areas and low-income groups underserved. For example, private fire brigades historically ignored non-paying homes, and private roads could mean tolls everywhere. People might face higher out-of-pocket costs, like for private school tuition, tolls, and health care, that exceed tax savings, especially for middle and low-income households. So, it's like for economic instability without the Fed, right? So you would expect like abolishing the Fed will stop inflation and return to sound money like gold, crypto, right? But the reality is that the Fed stabilizes the economy by managing money supply and interest rates. Without it, bank panics, like pre-1913, or deflation could spike. A gold standard limits money supply, choking growth, worsening recessions. Crypto is too volatile for everyday use. Bitcoin's price swings. Pew, pew, pew. Transitioning would likely trigger financial chaos. Think bank runs, hyperinflation. So, what's the overlooked impact here? Savings, loans, jobs could be wiped out in a monetary crisis, hitting ordinary people the hardest. Tax enforcement chaos without the IRS. You expect no IRS means no audit, no tax stress. But the reality is that even with a minimal tax system, tariffs, small sales tax, it still needs enforcement. Without the IRS like agency, evasion would soar, starving the government further. Historical tax free experiments like early U.S. tariff reliance still needed revenue collectors and faced smuggling issues. So, if some revenue is still needed, lack of enforcement could lead to unfairness where honest payers subsidized evaders. And the inequality surge, everyone benefits equally from tax cuts. The reality is scraping progressive taxes like income and inheritance while leaning on consumption taxes or fees disproportionately burdens lower income groups. The wealthy who rely less on wages and essentials would gain far more. U.S. wealth inequality could worsen, fueling social tension. So, middle and working class families might face higher relative costs for privatized services, erasing tax cut gains. And for the social and political backlash, you would think, oh, a smoother, freer society with lesser government, right? In reality, most people rely on government services, Medicare, public schools, highways, right? They would revolt. They would disappear. And, I mean, there would be riots everywhere. It would be crazy. Transitioning to a no-tax system would likely face massive resistance, delaying, derailing it. Political instability or gridlock could paralyze the economy, undermining the promised benefits. And the global disadvantages? A tax-free nation thrives independently. Reality, a weakened government could lose global influence. Tariffs to replace taxes might spark trade wars. Look at what Trump's just raised the tariff on China to 444% or something like that. Raising tax prices. Isolation could hurt competitiveness. Higher import costs, reduced exports could hit consumers and businesses, negating tax savings. So, why is it a risky gamble? The proposal assumes society can seamlessly shift to private or voluntary systems, but history shows this doesn't work. It doesn't work. People might also underestimate the transition pain. Abruptly cutting taxes and abolishing the Fed or the IRS, it could trigger an economic collapse, service gaps, public panic. I mean, a more balanced wish would be simplified taxes, like a flat tax or consumption-based tax with exemptions for food and meds, right? Lower fees, streamline vehicle registration or licensing without eliminating them, tying costs to usage. How about increasing transparency with the feds and the IRS? Downsize the IRS. Audit with the feds, okay, rather than abolishing them. These keep the spirit of freedom and efficiency without the catastrophic risks. So this proposal of all of this, no tax, no tax, no tax, no fee, no fee, no fee, could theoretically work in a small, resource-rich, or highly decentralized society with minimal government and strong private institutions. However, in a modern, complex economy like the United States, it's unlikely to succeed due to massive revenue shortfalls, economic instability, and social resistance. The abolishment of the Fed and the IRS amplifies the risks, as monetary and tax systems underpin stability. A gradual reform approach, simplifying taxes, reducing the fees, improving Fed accountability, might achieve similar goals with less disruption. But it's like wishing for a house without walls and appealing until the roof falls. People might love the idea of no taxes or government agencies until they face crumbling roads, unaffordable health care, or economic chaos. The fallout would hit the hardest those least equipped to handle it, middle and low income folks. And that's nothing but the truth and the facts. When I tell you I do my research, I do my research. And you might not like the truth. You might not like the facts. But that's all I'm going to give out to you here. All right, y'all, I'm out of here. I will see you in the next one, okay? You stay safe, you stay positive, you keep repping. And as always, fear less. Ciao.